Before we begin, I wanted to give a huge shout out to the folks at Amazon Music for partnering with us on this episode of the Inside Line F1 podcast. But more on this later. Right then, let's get right into today's episode.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this episode of the Inside Line F1 podcast. Clearly, it is not Somil Arora who's opening the podcast with his beautiful voice, with his beautiful metaphors and comparisons. It's me, Kunal Shah, reviewing, that's my first mistake already, but reviewing the 2024 Emilia Romagna Grand Prix. And with me is F1 stats guru Sundaram. And Sundaram, while I'm going to try and never imitate what Somil does because he's clearly in a league of his own, I'm going to just do it in my style. But the race was actually number two stands out for me because Max Verstappen won two races in one day. One was the virtual 24 hours of Nürburgring, and then the second was, of course, the Grand Prix at Imola. The other reason my number two came up for me is it was a race of two halves, especially if you ask the first two finishers, Max and Lando Norris, because for Max, he was on the medium and that was a race of his own. So that was the first half, and then on the hard, and that was a race of Lando Norris's, which he actually managed to stay ahead. And then the second, before we actually, dig deeper into everything, the second or the third time the number two, sort of strikes up for me is the drivers at the front actually had a very exciting race. But if you ask the drivers at the back of the field, Ricardo, Alonso, Logan Sargent and the likes, they actually said it was a very boring race, right? So I'm going to throw it up to you. Was it an exciting race or was it a boring race for you?
I think it did get a little monotonous somewhere in the initial one third of the race, initial third of the race, but I still think we had the Piastri Sainz battle going on at the time. And something that's really stood out for me was we had a very clean opening of the race since it's a very narrow track. I always had this in my mind that Verstappen and Norris are going to be banging wheels around the first couple of corners. We did not have that. Everyone went off pretty cleanly, and we did not have a safety car, which actually had 100% probability in the last couple of years. So surprisingly, we did not have a safety car, and that's why it seemed a little processional. But I think the latter half of the race, Norris and Verstappen, Leclerc and Norris also for a little period of time, I think it kind of made up for the whole of it.
There's this meme doing the rounds, lap 1 to lap 53, and everyone's just sitting and watching. And then
Yes.
lap 54 to lap 63, everyone's just cheering. I definitely resonate with that meme. There are very few memes I actually feel closely about. But since you are the Mr. Stats guru, right, here's a numerology, right, that I picked up from one of my findings. So Max Verstappen's race time was 1 hour, 25 minutes, 25 seconds and 25 tenths. I'm not making it up. So 25. So number two somewhere plays up there as well. But why don't we also start with our moment of the race, Sundaram? Why don't you take your pick and then I'll see how different it is from mine.
See, I would have probably gone for Ferrari, kind of having a slight brain fade, not bringing in Carlos Sainz as soon as Piastri pitted. They actually pitted him 4 laps later. But I think I'm actually going to go for the passes that Yuki Tsunoda and Nico Hülkenberg made. It's a very narrow track, like I said, and overtaking becomes very, very difficult. But they had literally the confidence to go. I think that was after the first corner, and which made me go, wow, this is a brilliant track to go racing at. It's a brilliant track when you make a pass. And it kind of made me feel we really miss these sort of classic circuits. There are some circuits like Spa or Mugello. I keep saying Mugello because I'm in awe of that circuit, and it's not been on the calendar for a couple of seasons, obviously. But when we go racing on these tracks, we see a different quality of racing, which we don't see in a Bahrain or in one of those Herman Tilke circuits. But I think Formula One also missed Imola. Verstappen said we should probably race in Imola more frequently. And for me, I think that was my moment of the day, seeing Tsunoda and Hülkenberg having the confidence around those initial corners to make a pass and making it stick, especially in a weekend when the gravel traps were a bit more closer to the racetrack. So there's a lot more to lose, but they pulled it off brilliantly. So I'm actually going to go for that.
I actually have no memory of Hulkenberg and Tsunoda, apart from the fact that Tsunoda had a brilliant pit stop strategy. He undercut Hulkenberg and then had a mega outlap to grab P10 in the race. Yet another point for the Racing Bulls. But my moment of the race, or rather, I'm going to probably put a couple of moments of the race. You already mentioned the opening lap and just how clean it was. And I was a little disappointed, saying, oh my God, they keep saying they're the best 20 drivers of the planet. And they actually were the best 20 drivers of the planet, or at least 18 of them, if I may, let some North American drivers not be on the list, but they actually were so clean, right? But just the moments before the opening lap, there's this beautiful shot. You're talking of a historic circuit. There's this beautiful shot, which the camera was just positioned, looking towards the start line. And it's not a straight start line. The way the camera was positioned for the few seconds on the world feed, you could see only Norris and then Max Verstappen, and the start line is also a little curved, which is not what you see in a lot of Tilke circuits. You will see it in Monaco, yes.
You don't.
We saw it.
You'll see it at Interlagos.
Yes.
You'll see it at Interlagos towards the back end of the field, but you don't see it in a lot of other circuits. You're right.
Exactly. So I love that. That to me was one of the moments saying, this is one of those old, really gorgeous circuits. That was that. But talking of a moment, if we may also classify it as an action point for the race, that moment was Lando Norris's several radio messages, but the one where he was told, Leclerc is pushing, and he's like, yeah, I'm also pushing. And then you thought, okay, maybe Lando's just playing it up. And then 3 or 5 laps later, he was just boom. And that moment, lap 54, like I spoke of that meme, that moment when he started attacking, he pulled some 10 seconds towards the end of a stint over those 16 or 17 odd laps. So to me, that moment just striking on when Lando Norris said, that's it, I think I have the pace and I'm going to go for the win, was what was my moment. We will dig deeper as to why could Lando Norris actually attack that late in the race. And one of my other favorite questions, just how did Max Verstappen and Red Bull Racing turn things around from that messy Friday, messy FP3, and manage to get pole and race win at Imola? So we're going to dig into that. But before that, another question for you, Sundaram, since we're going to keep asking questions, or rather, I'm going to keep asking questions. Who was your driver of the day at Imola?
If you ask for the driver of the day, it probably would be Lando. But I'm actually going to go for the driver of the weekend instead. If there were 2 drivers who really impressed me, one for very obvious reasons, Max Verstappen, the car was literally not at its 100%, but he still managed to ensure that he got pole position. Very smart usage of a certain toe that he received from someone else, which we'll talk about a little later. But also, when it's not the fastest car on track, he still managed to take that to the win. So he's one of my drivers of the weekend. Very impressive driving overall. But also Oscar Piastri. I would say he had a bit of a lukewarm start to the season, but he actually challenged Max Verstappen for pole position. He's just in his second year, I remember that. And he's already matching Lando Norris on and off in certain situations, in certain tracks. That's very nice to see, a person in just his second season. And when the car is there, it has the sort of pace, he's able to utilize that. Him doing extremely well in qualifying and also today to a great extent. So I'm actually going to go for Verstappen and Piastri as my drivers of the weekend. What about you?
You actually have left me no choice, okay? Because you took Norris, you took Piastri, you also mentioned Max in that. By the way, you slipped in Max, the way Max slipped in that pole position, surprising everybody. But I'm going to go completely left field, okay? I'm going to pick Fernando Alonso, okay? Second race in a row, he didn't make it to Q3. First time in 2024, he didn't score points. Driver of the weekend, literally driver of the last 2 weekends. And I'm, of course, being humorous when I say this, but very puzzling to see Fernando struggle. Both these weekends, it was Lance Stroll who out-qualified and outraced Fernando Alonso, which is something we don't really usually get to see, right? So technically, I'm actually praising Lance Stroll and calling him my driver of the day by bringing up Fernando Alonso. But no, I'm not, before we go there. But why don't we just instead of saying we're going to talk later, why don't we just dig into it? Because Lando Norris and Max Verstappen have been 1 and 2 for the third race in succession, right? The big question that we should try and answer was, how did Max Verstappen and Red Bull Racing recover from that messy start to the weekend? And, Sundaram, what really stands out for me is Christian Horner actually turned around and thanked a very old veteran Formula One driver. For the listeners listening in new, especially who probably not, followed Formula One 10 years ago, there was a driver called Sebastian Buemi who won everything everywhere else, but not in Formula One. He and Jake Dennis is also another Formula E driver, just as Buemi. They are simulator racers for Max Verstappen and Red Bull Racing. I wouldn't say Max Verstappen, for Red Bull Racing, right? And those two drivers, of course, back up the race team by being in the simulator. This time it was, Buemi's turn, Sebastian Buemi's turn, racing in the simulator. He did about 10 or 12 hours of sessions trying to figure what will work, what will not work, especially since Red Bull came up with a big upgrade. And, Buemi was definitely one of those drivers who helped, turn things around. And the second driver who really helped Max, like you've pointed out even on your Instagram page, was Nico Hulkenberg, a driver who almost became Max Verstappen's teammate had it not been for Checo Perez at the end of 2020. But Nico Hulkenberg took the tow from Max on his fast lap and then gave the tow to Max Verstappen in Q3. Can you imagine? Nico Hulkenberg is the reason why McLaren did not start 1-2 in today's race at Imola. Of course, Piastri's penalty notwithstanding, but Nico Hulkenberg, what a lad.
Haas is in fact one of the reasons why McLaren was not on the front row, because Magnussen was the driver who was impeded and Hulkenberg was the driver who gave Verstappen a little bit of a tow. So kind of diving deeper into it. So Nico Hulkenberg yesterday in qualifying was on his fast lap, and it's not that Verstappen and Nico had some sort of a pre-agreement before qualifying. I'm going to give you a little bit of a tow, you're going to give it to me and give it to me back. Verstappen, I think that's where a little bit of experience came in straight away. Verstappen knew Hulkenberg's on a fast lap. If I give him a little bit of a tow on the final sector, I know that once he crosses the start-finish line, he's going to back off. That's going to give me a tow into my next lap. And this very smart usage of this. And because of that, Verstappen managed to get a 10th or 2/10 on his final run. And if not for that, it would have actually been Oscar Piastri. But since he got the grid penalty, it would have been Lando Norris potentially on pole position. And like we've discussed so much already, overtaking is so difficult. This could have been Lando Norris' second race win in consecutive races. But Haas is one of the reasons why they didn't manage to do that. So that's very interesting. And the other point you mentioned about Sebastian Buemi is also something which people kind of overlook. People think that, once the sessions are done, free practice is done, teams do look into the data, but actually the reserve drivers or the simulator drivers, they spend hours and hours trying to find the best setup for the drivers before the next session. And that's incredible to see. So Sebastian Buemi doing 10, 12 hours. I think Horner mentioned they were using the simulator till I think the early hours in the morning. So him being a very instrumental part in Verstappen's win is very nice to see and hear.
And it also helps that, indicates that Red Bull has a very well correlated simulator. So what they see in the sim, they're able to extract in the real world results, especially, with the conditions, with the new upgrades they would have brought and so on. And so what would Sebastian Buemi would have done, just to simplify it further? He would have tried different setup options. And those setup options would have been like, this is what Max may like or may not like. And this is what Checo may like or may not like. And he also comes with several years of driving experience in the WEC Championship or the World Endurance Championship and Formula E and several races that he's done even in Formula One. But the key part here, so, Max Verstappen won just by 7/10. And Max very cheekily said, we ended the race just the way we started it, right? Because that's how close Lando Norris was, okay? And one of the reasons why I also started the episode by saying there are a race of two halves, the race on the medium tire, which Max said he was superior on. And we saw him pull out that, 7-8 second gap on Lando Norris, right? But it was a race on the hard tire, right? Which is what actually brought Lando Norris into play, because Max was very candid. He said the hard tire was just out of the window for us. We did not have any grip whatsoever. And for Norris, it was actually the other way around, where the hard tire brought him into play, right? So that was just how it all turned out for Max Verstappen. And we should, since we're talking of Max, Sundaram, also highlight that this was again one of those weekends where anybody and everybody who says it's the car that is bringing Max all that it's bringing, it was actually Max extracting all that he knows what to extract from a car. Because we're used to Max Verstappen winning, let's remember, right? Whether you may like it or not, but we're not used to him winning with such small margins. He is not used to winning with such small margins. He was challenged this race weekend to find the right setup. He put it on pole. He was challenged in the race. Imagine the lap just before the end where he went on to GP and said, my battery is not charging. Imagine he was pushed to use more of his tools to stay ahead. He had that black and white flag warning as well, so he couldn't abuse track limits as well, right? So hats off or helmets off to Max Verstappen. And again, the indicator here, Sundaram, is what happened to Checo Perez, right? Same car, same conditions, put under pressure. All the other rivals have thrown their upgrades and tools towards him. But Checo Perez was even slower than the Mercedes cars, right? He had to start on the reverse strategy and then just make the most of whatever he could.
And that's the thing, when the car's not completely perfect in terms of setup or in terms of balance, that's when the driver becomes the more important factor. What are you able to do with your limited tools and limited machinery? And that's why I said Verstappen putting it on pole, despite the car not being the fastest, was incredible. But probably Sergio Perez not being able to overcome those limitations was why he got knocked out in Q2, and he wasn't able to make the best out of his race. He also went off track. He lost, I think, a good 5 to 6 seconds, and he had to salvage. He came in P8. I think that's the best that he managed to do, also considering this was a very narrow track. But I've been saying this throughout last year. The reason why Red Bull had done so well last year was because Max Verstappen was able to push that car to that limit, despite not having a safety net of Sergio Perez. We've seen this a lot during the Mercedes dominance era, that Lewis Hamilton always has a Nico Rosberg or vice versa, so that they have multiple strategic options. We did not have a lot of that throughout last year. And when it comes to the moment where a McLaren or a Ferrari are able to challenge the Red Bull and a Perez is not there, that's when it would be difficult for Max Verstappen. And today was a classic example of that. If Sergio Perez is not there within the top 5 also, because we had Piastri and Norris both in the top 5, we had both Ferraris also in the top 5, and Perez back in P11, they have literally no option or no alternative as well to give any sort of benefit to Verstappen, and he's fighting out there alone. So it's going to be very, very crucial, especially in such tracks where overtaking is difficult. It's fine probably around Miami or a Bahrain, where overtaking is considerably easier. But these sort of tracks, Monaco, Imola, where overtaking is difficult, that's where the importance of Sergio Perez is a lot more.
That's true. And Checo Perez, in fact, then had to just run his own race from, whatever position he started, because he had to run the reverse strategy. So he started on the hard. And this is where I'm going to be a little fair to Checo, because if Max was struggling on the hard, you can imagine Checo on that hard at the start of a race, full fuel tanks. He was all over the place, but he still made some inroads, with the top 10. He was sort of messing up their strategies at some point. But, Checo's strategy was then clear that he was, waiting for a safety car, which never came. We spoke of a clean opening lap. There were no yellow flags, if I remember, or were there any?
There would have been if Perez went off track. There would have been some yellow flags at least.
But he was momentarily off track, right? Like a few seconds, and then.
But still, that still happens.
Okay.
Usually, when a driver is off track for some time, maybe if I think even Lewis Hamilton went off track.
He went off
the last
lap.
laps,
Correct. Yeah. So maybe some yellow flags.
So he might have had a yellow flag.
Yeah. But that's what happened to Perez. He was just running the hard tire, waiting for a safety car, and never came. He made that mistake. picked up some damage. And then the worst thing for Perez is this is that weekend where he actually lost P2 in the Drivers' Championship. And again, the popular viral posts on the internet are saying the true Checo Perez is now back, right? Because he didn't make it to Q3,
Yes.
which is what a typical Checo Perez would have done. He normally has a strong start to the season and then fades off by race 7, race 8. Today is one of those races as well, right?
When the upgrades come in, the moment the upgrades come in, he starts finding it a little difficult. Same with Bottas, like I mentioned in the preview as well.
So let's see. And, Checo Perez doesn't have a contract for next year. I know I tweeted saying Red Bull's going to look for an exit clause. And of course, that was a factually incorrect tweet because if he doesn't have a contract, he doesn't have an exit clause. But what I actually meant is, a performance clause, which then allows them to even more say, hey, you're not even P2 in the championship when we're winning everything else that we can. And that sort of automatically works against him with extensions and so on. So that second seat in the Red Bull might just be up for grabs, right? But we have to talk of the driver who finished second. We're 20 minutes in, and the driver who finished second, who almost would have finished first if he had one extra lap, because he kept saying he was actually praying for that one extra lap. And were you actually praying for that one extra lap, Sundaram? I'm guessing a lot of our listeners, a lot of Formula One fans were probably praying for that extra lap.
I think it always comes down to this, where I'm sure the teams, they plan when they really have to go and attack. And Norris started 10 laps earlier, and the prediction graphic that turned up, it says that he would catch up to Verstappen or have DRS within 5 laps. But the battle went on until the very last lap before he could actually bring it down to 1 second. And this is something that I've actually learned from you from going back to USA 2023. If I think it was Leclerc and Hamilton, if they had one more lap, he would have overtaken him. And you said, that's not the thing. Every race has a finite number of laps, and that's what you race against. And like Verstappen said in the press conference last year, you can make a lot of situations and scenarios, but I think Norris drove brilliantly today. And one thing I also kind of noticed over the last 2 races, which I have to mention, McLaren has done well on the harder compounds. If you remember in Miami, they were really able to put in the pace on the medium compounds in qualifying. But the moment they switched to the softs, they were not able to take the fastest lap. And even in the race, Norris was able to manage his hard tires much better. And the same happened today as well. He was really managing his tires, and at the last 10 laps, he was really able to bring them into the operating window. At the same time, when Verstappen's tires were going outside the window. But brilliant battle between the both of them. And I'm sure that win last week or the last weekend would have upped his confidence tenfold. And that's what really happens when you win a race. That desperation or that nervousness is out of the way, and you can really bring in that motivation and positivity. And he mentioned that today. I'm disappointed that I actually came second. You don't hear that a lot from a McLaren driver, and that kind of shows that there's a switch in their mentality, which is good to see.
Especially a driver who's finished second, 14 or 15 times. So, he's clearly used to finishing second. But he said, it pains that much more. That's what he said on the radio. And I suspect he also meant the same thing, that when you're so close to winning and you've already won, that feeling. Having a back-to-back race win would have been incredible for Lando Norris, for Formula One, I would say, and for McLaren. But the key to Norris, there are key insights that we should sort of look at. First, like you pointed out, he had a late race attack. That's what Christian Horner said as well, that the way Lando Norris's race came alive in the last third of the Grand Prix was phenomenal. And one of the reasons, why don't we just dig through that? So why could Lando Norris attack so late into the race? Let's dig into that, and then let's also switch it back to why could he not start attacking earlier? They are very interesting situations, right? So why could he attack so late in the race, right? One of the reasons he could, and he was candid about it, he said he was just firstly managing his race. He was not bothered about other people's lap times, which is why Leclerc could actually catch him at that certain point, and then he said everyone else's tires just fell apart. And because I was focusing on my tires, I had the pace to extract against Max so late in the race, right? So that was one part. Then the second part, like you also pointed out, Sundaram, is could he have actually overtaken Max Verstappen. The truth is, I would have actually for once liked that extra lap, and not to see if Norris could have won. But we actually did not see them battle wheel to wheel. We just saw Norris chasing. I think the closest he came was 7/10, and then he just finished 7/10, right? I would have loved to see them attack. I would have loved to see one attack from Lando Norris. He was trying everything to play with Max, but Max, of course, knew what was coming, right? And even adding more context to this, he couldn't attack, earlier than the last lap of the race. And he explained this very well. He said, when you get within 2 seconds of a driver, your tires start to overheat, you're losing, grip, you're still figuring out how to drive the car. It takes a couple of laps to settle in. And he said, by the time I settled in, it was already the last lap of the race, right? So very beautifully explained by Lando Norris as to sort of what happened with him in that battle, right? And to switch it back to, could he have attacked earlier in the race? That's what we are saying. And he actually struggled on the medium. So what you said, Sundaram, that when the compounds go harder, the McLaren gets better. That's actually what happened. He was struggling on the medium. And he said, we lost a lot of time in the early part of the race.
Indeed. And that's what every car or every team tends to function or perform better in different situations. While Red Bull were able to make best use of the mediums, it was the McLarens who did better on the hards. And if you compare Norris and Piastri actually got the fastest lap of the race in the initial laps on the hards because he was trying to undercut Carlos Sainz. And those initial laps after coming out of the pits, he was on fire, and he was even challenging Leclerc up to a point before he fell off. Leclerc on the other side, he was able to challenge Norris up to a point where then even he fell off, and then Norris was able to get his tires. He managed them extremely well. So different situations, and like you even hear the commentators say a lot, there's a certain period in which you can really push the tires, and once that is done, once you've hit the cliff, it all goes downhill. No matter how much you push, it doesn't go faster, which is what happened with Verstappen also towards the end.
Yeah, and then another insight which Lando Norris shared was McLaren had set up the car for cooler conditions because there was a bit of prediction that there could be some rain. So that setup also sort of compromised their charge in itself, right? And you also mentioned...
I'll tell you that.
Yes.
I'll tell you something. On the temperature part, I was just looking at the chart post-race that comes in from Pirelli. Just about the time when Piastri and when Norris launched that attack on Verstappen, temperatures cooled by around 5 degrees. It was around 45. It came down to nearly 40. Around the time when Norris started charging against Verstappen.
That's a brilliant insight. I'm sure there was a massive cloud over Imola which just brought the whole circuit. But that's a fairly strong drop in temperature, right? With what happened, but great battle, or a great attempt for a battle. Max was also confident that with the rear wing that they had, he could have defended very well on the straights itself. So this begs us to ask the question, 28 minutes in, but let's ask the question, are Max Verstappen and Red Bull Racing, is their dominance under threat with this, step by step, very cautiously, patiently upgraded McLaren? What do you think, Sundaram?
I think the dominance, of course, is under threat because last year there was such a wide performance gap. Red Bull, in a year when they were penalized for wind tunnel time, they still managed to come up with a rocket ship of a car. But they were so quick and the others were so slow. McLaren was completely elsewhere before the upgrades came in. Mercedes was struggling. Only Aston Martin was up there, so they made the best use of that. So the performance gap last year was a lot more. This year, it's a lot closer. McLaren and Ferrari have gotten a lot quicker. It's not to say that Red Bull have not made strides or they've not made improvements, but it's not as exponential as last year. And you also have to remember, Red Bull, when they have a very good weekend, when the pit stops and the balance and the setup is very good, they have a winning margin of 20 seconds. But on race weekends, with three practice sessions, and they have a bad weekend, they still manage to win, but it's by 1, 2, or 4 seconds. So they still are a cut above the rest. McLaren is still challenging them, but it's going to take a lot more than that, especially when you have a Max Verstappen in the car. He's going to do everything to ensure that the team gets a tenth or 2 tenths more from that car. So whenever they have some sort of a safety car interruption, an ill-timed safety car like Miami that went against them, or him having his engine blowing out. I think no, it wasn't his engine; it was his brakes in Australia.
Right.
Unless that really happens, I think it's not going to be the case, at least for the next couple of races. McLaren still has to do a little bit more, or beat them out on strategy. Like I said, there's no Perez, there's no safety net in these sort of races. Beat them out, beat them in strategy. But it's going to be an interesting battle, I would say. They have not been challenged to this extent, I think, probably since 21. The last race where I remember Verstappen being challenged was Canada 2022. Sainz really putting the pressure on Verstappen for the last 10-15 laps, and he did not buckle. Same happened today. But it's going to be an interesting next few races, I would say.
And this is what we want, right? We want a battle. We want a battle at the front, right? And we don't really care who wins. Even if Max gets battled and still wins everything, at least we'll be like, yeah, he was made to work hard. Like, imagine everyone being like, oh yeah, this is that weekend. Max has proved why he's 3 times world champion, generational talent, blah blah blah, right? That's what everyone's been saying. So I'm very glad we're gonna hopefully see this trend that these kind of races come. My feeling is, Red Bull and Max Verstappen. Okay, I'm going to just say Red Bull in this case. They will have circuits where they have their weaknesses. Imola was, one of those front limited circuits, again, with a bit of a weakness, right? At these kind of circuits with conditions and everything else falling in place, they are within reach. But when there are circuits that come where Red Bull has the absolute strength, we'll still see him winning by 10, 15 seconds is my guess, right? I don't think that the winning margins will then be this less. So let's see how this whole thing turns around, because the Mercedes is the only one that's not in this whole upgrade cycle just yet. But McLaren, Red Bull, and Ferrari are all three in a very, very strong development war. They're trying to be the one that's, getting these upgrades to take the battle to each other. We've seen how, especially McLaren, like you pointed out last year and this year, very steady but slow and measured strides, and now they're the whole communication strategy around McLaren has changed. Everyone, Zach Brown, Andrea Stella, and whoever else you ask, they say, yeah, I think now we are probably going to challenge Red Bull Racing. And this has actually happened only after Miami and after these upgrades that have come in, right? And you see the upgrades, Oscar Piastri also delivered on a track he's never driven before, right? So, they're delivering with both the drivers. I know you put up a very interesting story. McLaren has scored more podiums in the last 2 years than they did in the last 200 races, or some stat that you put out as well. And, phenomenal stuff as you always do. But we should probably move on to talking about Ferrari, because Charles Leclerc finished third, was not pleased. But very interesting, he actually turned around and said, I was very pleased with the upgrades. I was very pleased with the race execution, because he's got 2 new race engineers. He's got 2 new engineers in his team, a performance engineer, and then, of course, a new race engineer, right? And then he finished third. He said the upgrades actually delivered what the data would tell us they would. But again, a very interesting insight. He said Imola is about riding the curbs, and the Red Bull and the McLaren were riding the curbs better than we were, and which is why it's not the ideal place to check if our upgrades actually delivered or not.
There's a very good point that you mentioned over there. And what's also important to remember is that sometimes upgrades might not start showing gains straight away. It might take a couple of races for them to fine tune it. I think Ferrari also went on to say that their ERS management wasn't as good as how Red Bull and McLaren were able to do it. So that's the thing. Sometimes when you bring in upgrades, it really works in your favor. A very good example of obviously is McLaren. So last year, Aston Martin, I think they went a little behind with their upgrades. Mercedes has been a little slow with their upgrades, but this Ferrari upgrade in specific has been really hyped up for quite some time. I think there were even figures of 3 tenths or 4 tenths turning up on the internet. Carlos Sainz was actually quite defensive, I think, after qualifying yesterday. He said, I don't know, the upgrades are not as effective as it's been rumored on social media or within the media. But it's going to be an interesting thing to keep an eye on as well, and around Monaco and Canada, the next few races, different tracks, different demands, and how their upgrades work and how they're able to, iron their issues that they've had in this thing. But I think they'll be largely happy that they at least got onto the podium. That was the one thing that was really missing. and I think they'll take that, taking a P3 at Imola. I think they'll take that.
Missing since 2006, since Michael
6,
Schumacher
yes.
won for Ferrari at Imola, that famous race, him battling, alongside or against Fernando Alonso. But talking of Leclerc, right? He finished third, but he remains the only driver to have finished in the top 4 at every race this season. Carlos Sainz, on the other hand, who, by the way, I think Ferrari pitwall and Carlos Sainz himself, being the chief strategy officer at Ferrari, forgot what they were supposed to do because Sainz was undercut by Piastri, which is not something Sainz would normally take kindly. He takes his, it's like if Sainz is a bad race strategy, he takes it very personally. He's like, not only did the team mess up, but I didn't read the race correctly, right? That's how he usually goes, right? But Carlos Sainz has finished 5th for the 3rd consecutive race. So the first 3 races that he drove, he was on the podium. And then the next 3 races, he's been 5th at best, right? So that's there. And you mentioned something very interesting about Leclerc and the ERS strategy. Leclerc has actually been saying this, that he should have qualified ahead. And everyone's talking of track position, not only because of Imola, but the very fact that there is less than a tenth between Ferrari, Red Bull, and McLaren, right? And Leclerc actually explained, saying that McLaren and Red Bull have a better launch, right, on their qualifying lap. And I presume he means the exit of the final corner leading onto that curved, front straight, going into what we call as turn 1, but is actually classified as turn 2, right? And he said they just have a gain on us, which we are then left chasing for the rest of the lap. So it's always strange that Ferrari is always the ones, at least, in these situations, the ones who are playing catch up rather than the ones who will innovatively just have, okay, we just have the best energy deployment that we anyway do. But that's about Ferrari. We should talk about, I guess, Mercedes, because you mentioned Mercedes are just slow with the upgrades. Frankly, I thought you'll stop at Mercedes are just slow, because that's what it seems like, right? And I think it's just going to be a season where, they will bank on their customer team, McLaren, flying the honors at the front while they keep talking of catching up. But they had one of their best results since their opening round in Bahrain, so it's not that bad. But George Russell actually pitted, and he lost a track position to Lewis Hamilton. And interestingly, there was a lot of exchange on the radio before it happened, which didn't play out on the world feed. And George was very honest. He said, I need to know that I'm not just aimlessly, pointlessly giving up track position to Lewis. And then he pitted, of course, to take the fastest lap of the race, the extra point that he wanted. So that's how close this battle, that they also see that they want to keep that extra point if they have the chance. But can you imagine? He had a free pit stop over Checo Perez at that point, right? That's how much pace that the top 3 teams and, Mercedes also had, that they had a free pit stop they could utilize.
Yeah, actually, I think Perez was a good 26, 27 seconds, which is a very good point that you mentioned over there, because the Imola pit lane is the longest of the calendar. It takes a good 25 to 27 seconds by the time you're out of the pit lane. And Perez was 29 or 28 seconds behind Hamilton, if I'm not wrong. And they made a very good choice of obviously Russell being the one who had to pit and then go for the fastest lap. It's still one important point for the team, especially since they're in the midfield. But obviously, drivers wouldn't want to lose out to their teammate more than anyone else. You kind of lose that psychological edge, especially if you're one place behind him. That too, it's not his fault at all. So eventually, at the end of the season, you'll probably look at the head-to-head and you'll say that Hamilton has won race more against Russell. But when you look into the context of it today, Russell was supposed to stay up ahead. But yeah, little things here and there, and I'm sure he's not going to be very happy with it. But at the end of the day, he's going to come out and say that, yeah, we had one extra point for the team, and that's what matters.
Do you think, Sundaram, that Mercedes are actually the best of the rest now amongst the whole field? Because Aston Martin has sort of dropped back the last couple of races. Their upgrades haven't delivered what they were wanting. And you explained very well that the minute you bring upgrades, doesn't mean you automatically deliver. It takes you a certain number of hours and sessions. In fact, Max was very candid in saying sometimes it just takes you a few more races to extract more from the setup in itself. Because just because you bring an upgrade doesn't mean you go quicker. You could actually go slower as well. Not all upgrades deliver. Case in point, Aston Martin and their struggle, especially with Fernando. But at this juncture, I believe Mercedes are the best of the rest. And the best of the rest is classified as just after the top three. Do you also share the same opinion? Or do you think what Lewis Hamilton thinks? Lewis Hamilton at this just before the start of the race said, I have Yuki Tsunoda with me and I need to make sure that I'm able to beat him. Or are racing bulls the best of the rest?
It's a really odd question because, I mean, first of all, Mercedes' fall is a little disappointing, firstly. They finished second in the constructors last year, right?
Yeah.
If I'm not wrong. Yes, they did.
Yeah.
They finished second, and we're speaking about Mercedes being the best of the rest at a time when they really don't understand their car. They're taking it literally session by session or race weekend by race weekend, and they're trying to understand where that car actually belongs and how it performs. And we're calling them the best of the rest, even when they're not performing at their best. Aston Martin has been a bit disappointing these last couple of races. They've kind of fallen backwards. Fernando Alonso, especially, he's had a couple of disappointing weekends. But what's really working at RB and Haas, I would say, is individual drivers who are really being the flag bearers over there. Yuki Tsunoda doing exceptionally well. I think 5 Q3 appearances, and Nico Hülkenberg, I think 4 Q3 appearances. They're
Correct.
really single-handedly taking that team forward. Ricciardo had one good sprint. Magnussen's had a couple of very aggressive defensive races, that I would say. But so far, yes, it does look like Mercedes are the best of the rest.
I have to say, Magnussen is my driver of the weekend. For once, he did not pick up a penalty point. And he finished 12th, his best result of the season. But since you mentioned Mercedes and their context of Aston Martin and McLaren, very interestingly, Mercedes at 79 points. McLaren is almost double of them at 154 points. And Aston Martin is almost half of them at 44 points. And Aston Martin in the last 3 races have scored 7, 2, and 2 points. You know the math? That's 11 points only. Can you imagine? That's just how bad it can get for them if, Fernando Alonso is not doing the whole heavy lifting that's there, right? But I think it's also interesting. Maybe we can just switch to talking about Aston Martin, because Stroll has, outperformed Fernando Alonso the last couple of races, right? And Fernando Alonso, 2 bad qualifying sessions in the race, made a setup change, started from the pit lane, and then very interestingly said, I'm waiting for the team to tell me what data they found, because they have a comparison of 2 different setups on my car. And then it's not just us who can't handle a slow Fernando Alonso. The Aston Martin, the front left brake decided to catch fire because the Aston Martin is not used to Fernando Alonso driving slowly.
Yeah, very, very uncharacteristic of Alonso actually crashing. And I think this happened a couple of years ago in Belgium as well. And the moment that happened, everyone was saying the same thing. It's very odd to see Fernando Alonso making a mistake in one of the other sessions and then crashing his car. It's very odd, very unlike Fernando. But that's the thing. When he's not there, or when he and the car are not at one, these are the sort of weekends. And his body language in general this weekend was very off. He seemed pretty miffed even after qualifying. Today he said, I think after the race, that this was the most boring race of the season, or most boring race of for me in a while. And that's the thing, where you don't want to have an angry or an annoyed Fernando Alonso within your team. So Aston Martin really have to pull up the socks and figure out what's really not working within that team and ensure they give him a good package for the next couple of races.
I really liked what you said, the boring race. And we'll get to that because we've got a lot of bottom team runners who actually said this was a boring race. We'll tell you why we think that probably is, of course, happened. But talking of Fernando Alonso, since you were already there, Fernando Alonso got overtaken by Lewis Hamilton for 8th place in the Constructors or Drivers' Championship, right? And so Fernando's got 33. Lewis has now got 35. Also, Lewis is, 8th in the Drivers' Championship, 9 points behind George Russell, which is, where the story has always been in the last couple of seasons. But if we can just briefly move on, 45 minutes into this episode, we could probably just discuss Racing Bulls, right? Because both the drivers in Q3, which is great for Ricardo, Yuki Tsunoda, like I said at the earlier part of the episode as well, brilliant outlap, did undercut Hulkenberg, and then after that, Hulkenberg said there was nothing I could do to get that place back, and that's how close it is between them on track. Especially on this track where overtaking is difficult and track position is everything. But this brings me to ask the question, because Alexander Albon, who didn't finish the race because of a cross wheel nut, right? Like you said earlier, actually said we didn't lose too much from the race because the midfield teams did not score much. And he's right, because it was just Racing Bulls that scored a point. The other 9 positions were all by the top 5 teams, right? Do you believe that there is a larger gap between the top 5 and the bottom 5 teams, and it is sort of increasing? Because Esteban Ocon said, we deserved a point in Miami. We did not deserve a point today. Albon, like I said, has already said the midfield didn't score much. The top 10 drivers, or rather the bottom 10 drivers, I'll put it that way, right? The top 3 drivers, so that was Max Verstappen, Lando Norris, and Charles Leclerc, actually lapped drivers all the way up to P10, right? So do you think that the gap between the top 5 and the bottom 5 is actually increasing?
I think that's been the theme of this season so far, and also why Tsunoda and Hulkenberg's performances are that rated, and also probably why there's been this discussion about more drivers or more teams getting points. Is it the top 12 or the top 15? For the fact that largely you would expect the top 5 teams to lock out all the points paying positions, and on the odd occasion when you have a driver not having a very good day, and what's been the case in this season has been a Mercedes car or an Aston Martin car or a Lance Stroll in specific having an off day. That's when Yuki and Nico have been able to steal points off of them. And I think that's what their target is. When one of these cars or these teams have an off day, we will be there, we will be present to take off those points. And they've been doing well, actually. They've not been missing out. They've not been making mistakes. So Tsunoda and Hulkenberg have been just waiting patiently to see one of these cars stumble, and they've been doing that. But yes, the bottom teams, especially Williams, they've not scored a single point this season. It's very odd considering the sort of season they had last year. Alex Albon, actually, this is his longest pointless streak in Formula One. So he's on a very bad streak at this point in time. So they really have to do a lot more to be closer to 12th, 11th, 10th, and have luck go their way.
Very interestingly, and I'm going to read out a stat. Nico Hulkenberg has finished 11th 3 times this season, right? And apart from Bahrain, 11th has actually been Hulkenberg's worst finish in 2024. So that's how good he's been, right? We also spoke of, I think you picked Oscar Piastri. I forgot mentioning this, but Piastri is either finished 8th or 3rd. Sorry, 8th or 4th. That's it. He's not, and then of course he's the only Ferrari McLaren driver to have not scored a podium yet in 2024. But which actually brings us to the question: any other facts or stats that stood out for Mr. F1 Stats Guru from this weekend's MSC Grand Prix? Since that's what I said, I'm going to call it in the preview.
I did have a couple, but actually something that really baffled me was McLaren this year are the only team to not be eliminated in Q1 or Q2. They've made it to Q3 every single time, and they are the only team to do that this year. And if I'm not wrong, Lando Norris has the most P2s since the start of 2023. He was actually tied with Sergio Perez, if I'm not wrong. I'm actually going to have to look back into this. But I think Lando Norris has the most P2s since the start of 2023. And yeah, this kind of goes to show the sort of season that he's had since Austria last year.
Wow. Incredible. One of my favorite stats, Alexander Albon has qualified 14th for 4 consecutive races. 3 or 4 consecutive races, I can't remember.
3 or 4, yes.
And then lots of drivers from different teams have actually finished in 11th. And I'm going to read that out. So in Bahrain, we had Zhou Guanyu, who was 11th. They had slow stops. By the way, Sauber's slow stops could just be, a thing of the past because they brought their pit stop equipment, the upgrades, this weekend, right? So we probably didn't see them having a slow stop because they probably didn't have a slow stop, right? So it was Zhou Guanyu who finished 11th in Bahrain. Then it was Alexander Albon in Saudi and Australia. Okay. Then it was Nico Hulkenberg in Japan. It was Ocon in China. And then it's been Hulkenberg in Miami and Imola. Right. So that's literally every team on the bottom part of the grid that has finished 11th. And this is interesting to always say what you said, that it's either Tsunoda or Hulkenberg who actually score the point if the top five are not scoring. But it's the driver who comes 11th. There have been so many different drivers who have come 11th, right? But 50 minutes in, that's almost an hour that everyone has spent with us. I'm sure you all missed.
For a race that was supposedly boring, I think we had a lot to speak about, though.
Yeah, and everyone whom I'm pretty sure you'll miss Somil Arora because I realized that he is so bloody good. But after 350 odd episodes that he's probably done at the front, he's just on a holiday in the northeast part of India. So if anyone's listening in from the northeast in Sikkim, Gangtok, or even Darjeeling, he's probably hanging around some of those streets somewhere. Give him a shout. But thank you very much. It is a double header race weekend, which means we will be back soon with the Monaco preview. And that's always a race that excites even more so on the Saturday. And thank you so much for your time, Sundaram. Thank you everyone for listening. And you will hear from us in a few days.
Thank you so much for tuning in to this episode of the Inside Line F1 podcast. Before we ended, I just wanted to say a huge thank you to Amazon Music once again for partnering with us on this episode of the podcast.